There we go. This is what we're discussing today. Civil liberties in the information society. We've got a cracking panel to speak to us. We've got Jeff White, journalist Jeff White. We've got Ivana Bartoletti, who did a great presentation for us at last year's award-winning Insights event. And we've got John Higgins, who is BCS Vice President. I'm just going to, before we start, talk about this, the BCS Vital Worker campaign. So we started this series of webinars pretty soon after lockdown because we realized that we don't often get a chance to shout out about IT workers as much as we ought to. Obviously, that's what we at BCS want to be doing because we're all about making IT good for society. But of course, a lot of people have stepped up to the plate and done some tremendous work in the intervening time. So I'm going to stop showing my screen now. And then you'll be able to see all our participants. So let's say hello to Jeff White. Hello, Jeff.
Hello.
Hello to John Higgins. Hi, John. And hello to Ivana Bartoletti. Hi, Ivana.
Hi. Hello. Hi.
Welcome to all of you. Now we're going to have about a 30-minute conversation together. Obviously, it's a massive subject that we're not going to be delving into in great depth, but this is about just raising the issues. John will be able to give us a little bit of a BCS angle on it. Jeff and Ivana have both recently written books. Well, actually, Jeff's is coming out shortly. Jeff's book is coming out shortly about some of these issues that affect society. And of course, this is BCS's wheelhouse. Now, you'll notice on your control panel for GoToWebinar, there's a little thing marked questions. I can see that. So as we go through, please put questions in there. And then for the last 15 minutes, we'll put those to the panel as well. So the first thing I just wanted to talk about with you folks was really whether we've got our priorities right and what's a danger and what isn't. I've thought of this as real issues versus smoke screens. So for example, people are very fearful about the dark web, but actually there might be other things to worry about in terms of civil liberties. Perhaps we can start with Ivana on that. What's your feeling? Have we got our sense of risk right?
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, it's, the sense of risk. So yes, the question, in my view, we haven't really got the risk right at the moment, in the sense that a lot of people, when we think about technology and when we think about, especially disruptive technologies, think about artificial intelligence, or they immediately think about something which is so futuristic. They immediately think about incredible machines, human-like robots, and really futuristic things that are coming over us and changing the way we live and changing the way we. Reality is that we're near that, and reality is that what is happening right now, to me, is far more pervasive and needs far greater attention when it comes to civil liberties than a lot of the things that we seem to be discussing. I'm thinking about the digital ecosystem as an architectural persuasion, and I'm thinking about algorithmic driven advertising, and I'm talking about context-aware behavioral analytics, and I'm talking about algorithms that seem to be able to hack our weaknesses when we browse online, and then serve us adverts that respond to something that is very intimate to us. And by doing so, really put at risk our autonomy, which is probably the greatest value that we have. And to me, in the age we live in, saying this after 20 years in privacy law, but privacy is all about personal autonomy. And so when it comes to really look at the risk, I always say, let's look at what's happening now. And we've had great discussions about this. We've had surveillance capitalism. We've had a lot of public recognition of what is happening in the digital ecosystem. Not latest, a lot of understanding around the fact that we can have the perfect technology, even develop the perfect technology, but that is not going to be necessarily developed and deployed for the right thing. Look at what's happened in the US with Black Lives Matter in here. where you have technology like facial recognition that it can become perfect at recognizing Black people, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be used in an ethical way, and it doesn't mean that the tech itself may be biased. So the reason why I'm saying all this is because we gotta get it right and understand that we are at a moment where the digital ecosystem that we live in has grown wild. And it's not by chance that the companies itself, for different reasons, I say that ironically, but for different reasons, they are asking themselves to put some public debate around things, to put some governance around things. And this is happening. It's happening, and we're seeing a lot of citizens and consumers demanding transparency. Trust has become the #1 issue, as is to be traceability in the food labeling, for example. I think when it comes to risk and our civil liberties, we have to think about what are the values that we want to protect and what are the values that are at risk. And the values, to me, are most of the moment: autonomy, freedom, privacy, and what I find very relevant in the moment is autonomy of thinking, because with us seeing all different things, each one of us seeing different things and being served different ads, sometimes I think, well, what are we going to talk about if we all see different things and see a different vision and version of reality? So it's an historic moment. It is an historic moment. And I think, with the COVID-19, which has shown us that there is something very valuable in personal information. So COVID-19 has shown that we're very connected, that my data is very relevant to yours, John and Jeff. It's really important. If I'm ill, you become ill. So we need to share this data. It's important, but equally, it has demonstrated that ethics and privacy and the value of our civil liberties matter to people. And we have to find the right point, which is not a trade-off, as people think, and that infuriates me as a language. It's not a trade-off. It's literally about what are the values that we want to protect? What are the civil liberties? What are the human rights? And I think that is the point, starting point of us. So I'm happy talking about loads of things. I'm happy about, but the problem is trying to get it right and focus on what is at stake here.
Good stuff. Brian, I don't know whether we lost Brian. I can't see him on my screen anymore, but I don't know whether he wants me to pick up off the back of that. Happy to do so.
Carry on, Jeff. I can't see him either.
Maybe we lost Brian, lost our host. We're rudderless in the internet. Ivana, I thought that was really interesting. I think you're right. It is there. We are at a turning point. I mean, it's interesting. So I started at Channel 4 News about maybe 8 years ago. I did a project called the Data Baby Project, which was all about how our personal data was being used and abused online. We set up a fake persona, basically, and then we were trying to track through this persona how information was used and abused in the online space. And I'll be honest, it was a groundbreaking project that no one gave us stuff about. We had real trouble getting anyone to give a damn about this project. They just didn't get it. They could sort of see there was something there, but actually really engaging with it didn't happen. And then, of course, Cambridge Analytica happened, and suddenly people started paying attention to this. They may not still have understood quite the ins and outs of the story, but suddenly personal data was a thing. And so that was, I think, a sort of leap forward. Then we had the US presidential election in 2016, and we saw the shenanigans around social media manipulation. We saw the outright hacking of the Democrats, and we saw information manipulation being carried out there. And I think that was another sort of step change in people's understanding of this. So I think the battle to make people care about it and believe it's something that they should care about in terms of privacy, in terms of personal data, I think that battles, we've won quite a few, the campaigners have won quite a few of those battles. But the problem is, each time the understanding advances, the technology advances. And again, Ivana, you talked about facial recognition. It is a bewilderingly complicated subject, facial recognition. Just getting your head around the technology, let alone the sort of biases that are built in, let alone the cross-referencing with databases that are built into facial recognition. It's incredibly difficult to get your head around this. And so for people who are worried about privacy, who are worried about surveillance, just getting up to speed on how that facial recognition technology works is really tough. It's really not easy to do. And one of the things in it that I think, and I know Ivana's written about this and far more knowledgeable than I am about it, one of the tricky things as we move into an AI future is this idea that the AI decision-making processes, the algorithms, have got so refined and so complicated and so big that it's impossible really for human beings to reverse the algorithms and to work out why they made the decisions they did. And I think that's a really big problem we're going to have to surmount as a society, is not being able to interrogate the machine and take the bits apart to work out how it got to the point that it did. But I am encouraged, you know, that people are taking privacy seriously, particularly in the recent coronavirus pandemic, or the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. You know, the concern around the contact tracing app, I thought was well placed, and B, was quite well informed. I mean, it didn't take people long to kind of start to work out, well, these are the different models being used, these are our concerns. And the questions coming in from techies, the questions coming in from privacy campaigners, civil liberties campaigners, the questions coming in from journalists, there was this really interesting sort of alliance of questioning around the coronavirus app. And that all, I think, reflects society, reflects society's wish to kind of know, okay, where's our data being used? How's it being used? So I have seen a journey. I've seen a journey of public kind of understanding and public caring about this stuff. But alongside it, I've also seen a massive, rapid expansion of the kind of technology that's being used, the scale of technology and the complexity of technology. And it's almost like the two things are kind of running together. That's broadly speaking kind of my outlook on it. I don't know whether that helps. But we've got Brian back in the room now, so hopefully he can.
I am back. Thank you for carrying on, folks, as you so clearly did. Appreciate that very much. In fact, we've had a whole bunch of questions come in already, so although I didn't hear some of those bits, obviously, let's just pose one of those while we're here. Ivana mentioned facial recognition software, it says here. There are as many cases of authorities wrongly identifying people as suspects as not. It's also poor at identifying people of colour, that we know. Should laws penalise authorities and organisations for use of faulty tech? I suppose that's a question of where the responsibility lies. Now, that's got your name on it, Ivana.
Brian, I wonder if before we do that, I could just maybe do another little bit scene setting, maybe a bit of context from a
Carry on, John.
I think while you slipped out of the room to get yourself a coffee or whatever you did, I didn't get the opportunity to do that, and I'd like to. So the BCS, the Chartered Institute, is all about making IT good for society. I mean, it's 60-odd thousand members are focused on how can IT be used to benefit people and organisations, the economy and society. I mean, that's the focus. And I don't speak for the BCS when I say this, but I think I have a sense of what most individuals who've worked like I have in tech over many years, what a lot of us are trying to do, which is we're trying to use the tech for good stuff, whatever that good stuff is. And we know that the way societies adopt technology is a bit sort of fits and starts. You start to use something and then you think, oh my goodness, I didn't realize it could do that. Or, you start to understand the implications of it, and then you start to try and build an ethical base around it. So I think what the process that we're going through might be a more accelerated version of what we're used to, and it might be more complex, but I don't think we should think of it as a terribly frightening thing. We've got lots of good stuff. We've got lots of good tools. It can be used for good or bad. We need to have proper debates about how it should or shouldn't be used, and we should approach it with a sort of healthy skepticism. We should, but not cynicism, I would say. And we need to understand that bad guys and good guys can use, any sort of a knife, a hammer, a gun, or IT. It doesn't matter, it can all be used. And I've seen some horrible examples of, like we all have probably, of how this technology can be used. I do want to pick up maybe a couple of points. I agree entirely with Ivana that it's not a trade-off. You often hear this. I heard this quite a lot in Brussels. It's either privacy or security, and I used to say it's not. It's both. It's an and. It's not an or. And I think we should have that in mind all the time. It's not a trade-off. The other thing I think that Ivana said was about, and Jeff as well, about how you begin to understand this stuff. It's difficult to understand, and I think one of the responsibilities that we have as professionals is to help with that understanding. Just coming back to the topic of this conversation about IT and human rights specifically, a colleague of mine produced a report recently for Equinet, and one of the points they made was that the equality bodies need to understand the more precisely what some of these issues are, like AI transparency. You know, you need to get under the surface of it a little bit in order that you can make a proper and sensible contribution to the debate. And I think we at BCS definitely have a responsibility for improving that understanding. And finally, just come to that point about tech, and you know, and the app, you know, the track and trace app. Again, we've got to distinguish between what the technology will do and the sort of political motivations behind the people who are desperate to get an app out, whether it works or not, sort of things. And I think what the BCS did very well there was to identify a set of sort of guidelines and principles and said, look, you know, we need to be following these. And I think that's exactly the right sort of thing. Is we must make sure that the motivations, whatever they are, political, financial, or whatever, to use technology when it's either not quite ready or it's not quite right, we need to sort of see through those motivations and understand them. So, Brian, I'll let you ask your question now. Sorry.
That's not a problem at all. Actually, we can deal with the questions as and when. That's not an issue at all, John. I didn't realise you hadn't spoken yet. I do apologise. And as a BCS person, I've got to keep you on side. Anyway, so I'm just thinking about the governmental angle then, as you just touched on that. Other related areas are like trust in voting, the transparency of our data usage, the way our health data is used. All these things are coming together, aren't they? Almost at the same time. So we often feel disempowered as individuals. How can we get back a little sense of we have some control? Just thinking of it from our day-to-day life, really. Jeff, can I come to you?
I think you're right. I think the trust issues are starting to permeate through lots of different parts of society. And obviously, you mentioned health data, voting data, and so on. I do worry sometimes that we have potentially gone too far the other way. So, you know, for years, obviously, I've been banging on about privacy and personal data and tracking and all these kind of things, and security, and you know, trying to get people to listen. I worry now that people are so attuned to this that they're starting to see problems where problems don't exist. They're starting to worry about problems where those problems don't exist. And there's a danger, I think, in that we get to the point where people feel so distrustful of everything that they're unable to make decisions, we're unable to stick with anything, that 1,000 questions get asked and we're unable to take any action as a result of that. And particularly around, I mean, it's a sort of thing around the disinformation piece here. You know, part of the corrosive effect of disinformation is it makes you distrust all information. So we've got to the point now where some friends of mine, well, I don't believe anything I hear, anything I read online, anything anywhere. And I think, well, yeah, but that means the people who planted these disinformation campaigns have won, because they haven't just infected your ability to believe the disinformation, they've affected your ability to believe any information. I do think for the public there's a role in it. I always used to, when I was at school, I used to take the piss out of media studies. You know, media studies was the sort of joke subject when I was at school and at university of all media studies. And yet now I've totally reversed position on that. It's absolutely essential that people question where information is coming from, start to do their own digging, their own research, start to do their own Googling. Because the danger in society at the moment is it's painfully easy for you just to like something or share something or comment on something just quickly, even if you think, oh, it's rubbish. I know that's fake news, I know it's rubbish, but I'm just going to click the share button, click the like button. And that one little engagement, even clicking the link through to see that article. And that one little engagement is clicking the link through to see that article. I'm getting my own voice back here. Even just that one little click on the information is enough to raise that profile of that article in social media. Just one like, one comment, one share. And so I think all of society has to get better at doing that. And hopefully that will improve our trust generally in technology.
So I think that leads us on to bringing Ivana in about the AI syndrome. Then employed so-called AI journey. Really, it was just an algorithm stories for their front page, wasn't that? Almost straight away, there was a problem with the race. Why is that feeding back?
Brian, can I interrupt you? We are getting and I wonder, Ivana, that's not couldn't be your. Are you on?
There's a terrible delay on that, isn't there? Let me just go to our technical fellow. Simon, you got any thoughts on this?
No thoughts specifically. Brian, can you just keep talking for a second while I just have a play on?
Sure. Is it still feeding back? Actually, that sounds a little bit better now, doesn't it? It might be because we just all need to be on mute when one person's talking or something like that. Okay. So, Ivani, so I was just talking about the example from a couple of weeks ago where MSN had what people called an AI to choose stories for their homepage. It was really just a quite simple algorithm getting rid of some journalists. And within a week, it had misidentified some racial characteristics and upset quite a lot of people. And that kind of fits in with Jeff's point here, doesn't it, about where we're getting information from, particularly if it's starting to be mediated by automatic systems. What's your take on that as an AI ethicist?
I think we may have lost Ivana as well. I don't know.
We're having no joy today, are we? Well, let's come to John while you're on. Oh, Ivana.
Oh, am I back?
You are back. You're back on audio. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Right. Sorry, what was the question?
it was about using AI as an intermediary to get information out to people. With the example recently of MSN replacing some of their journalists with a learning algorithm that didn't produce a very good selection of stories. Just wonder what your take on that was as an AI ethicist. So we've got AI as an intermediary now to getting information, even. Jeff was talking about the way we trust our information sources.
Yeah, I mean, the key problem in my view is that so just to make a point on this, so John said it correctly. He said, you know, there's a lot of good things happening, and it's true. We're seeing companies taking action themselves. You know, so for example, Twitter now, if you reshare an article, they would ask you, have you read it? All right. So we are seeing certain things happening. We've got a white paper into online harms, and we've got action being taken and perhaps regulation soon, which will mean that companies will have duty of care enshrined in the law, and therefore they'll be taken up for, you know, what they do. So what I mean is that there is some action happening, which is good. At the same time, we are seeing companies taking this seriously and really noticing that privacy is a real differentiator, and so is ethics in the way that they approach things. So this is all positive. In terms of the negative side, that is that, and this is very relevant to the question you're asking, is that we need a public conversation and a very clear assessment of how far we want these things to go. So, for example, in the problem that we've got with disinformation is that underlying all this, there is a system online that rewards, and this is algorithmic based, that rewards systems that are more divisive than others. So obviously, if you say something which creates more of a debate, then it will be pushed up and people will see it much more. So obviously, this is the business model of some organizations and platforms. Therefore, you know, when we talk about these things, we're talking about the right and the center of the sort of this business model. So this is why I think this is the time where, you know, we need to understand what is happening to our digital ecosystem, what regulation we've got in place that can deal with the harms that these algorithmic driven systems can generate. And when I talk about harms, is obviously disinformation is one, being locked out of particular services. So the allocation harm is another one. Representational harm is another big one, because if you have algorithms, for example, that advertise jobs that pay less to women and jobs that pay more to women because of historic data, then not only you lock people out of opportunities potentially, but you're also perpetuating social inequalities and structures that are in society right now. So we've got to look really at the harms and say, okay, what are the things that we need to safeguard? What are the civil liberties that we want to safeguard? And how do we need to intervene, both as governments and regulators and also as organizations and in sort of individually? So that is the picture. I mean, I do worry about the ecosystem when it comes to information and algorithms using to curate, edit, and decide what we see and what we do not see. To me, that is the core of the issues that we're witnessing in the online ecosystem right now. The fact that algorithms decide what we get to see, the fact that algorithms decide and curate the image of the world that we get. To me, that is the most problematic thing that we have at the moment. And that requires really an understanding of what is a risk. And to me, what is a risk is the autonomy of exploring life and meeting your interest and your passions and the things that you want to read, not because they've been recommended by an algorithm, but because you've explored them and you want to see them.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, as a journalist, I'm not that keen on AI doing my job either, particularly. But John, I'm going to come to you, and as I come to you, I'm going to just put a little question that's come through as well. Shouldn't we attach provenance to online information to counter disinformation? Now, we do that to a certain extent where, we have academic processes, don't we? Can I come to you, John?
Yeah, I think a good test is to say, what if I replace person instead of algorithm? I say person. I mean, because you could have, in your example about CNN, was it CNN and the sort of choosing your media for you? You could just have had a badly trained person doing that instead. It's not really a thing about the technology or about the fact that it's an algorithm. I mean, equally, you could have a person or a group of people who are focused on trying to promote divisiveness. You could do it. It's not the technology per se that's doing this. So I think distinguishing what's an issue to do with the algorithm and what's an issue to do with just human behavior is quite important. I think the things that are difficult about algorithms are the transparency, how do you look inside them? And I know a lot of people have been looking very hard at that, because that is an important and distinct thing about an algorithm. How do you know what it's doing? But I think it's let's not. I think there's a danger in sort of trying to fix all of society's ills through fixing algorithms. I think we need to distinguish between what's a bit of tech and what's human behavior. And I think your question about provenance is a very good one. That's nothing to do with technology per se. It's like, which newspapers do you trust? Will you read the Daily Mail? Will you read the Telegraph? I mean, what will you do? So I don't think it's a technology issue per se.
Well, I mean, that is part of the whole conversation here, isn't it? That there's always the argument, as with art, that technology reflects the society in which it lives. Jeff, what do you think about that idea of provenance and how we might be able to assess that a little bit more effectively?
It's really interesting. I started thinking recently about the origins of Google. As I understand it, Sergey Brin and Larry Page were students at Stanford, and were trying to look at how you categorize and verify and attach importance to information. And so they looked at the idea of academic citation. So basically, if an academic article is any good, it will be cited here, there, and everywhere, and it will rise up the rankings. And if you look at PageRank and what Google did originally with PageRank, it was that. It was basically like, okay, an online article is as good as the number of people who are pointing towards it. So I do find, that there is a history of this kind of idea of how do we watermark information? How do we watermark it such that the authority that it initially had stays with it as it moves through the online ecosystem. So I think it's really fertile space to explore. The problem is, of course, as soon as Google came out, people started gaming the algorithm and started, you know, backlinking, and they're all dark links and that kind of thing. So I think with any system where you're trying to sort of, you know, impute the system or imply into the system authority, you've got to be aware of how people are going to try and game that system. But I do think it's very much worth doing. Just on the algorithmic news stuff, by the way, I mean, this has been around for quite a while. There are companies who specialize in algorithmically written news, so they have machines that write the news story. Those organizations, as far as I'm aware, are quite, you know, keen on keeping human journalists. They see themselves as an adjunct to human journalists. Maybe a quicker first version of the story might get written by a machine, but later on a human being will come back and re-edit it and put in all of the context and so on. But I think the wonderful thing about this is, you know, there's been a lot of concern recently about journalists being, you know, gatekeepers. You're the gatekeepers of the information. You mainstream media journalists, you know, like we're sort of evil geniuses who cook up our plan for what the world's going to look like. And that somehow algorithms will be better. And I think one of the, you know, wonderful side effects of stories like the MSN one is that, you know, leaving it to a machine doesn't give you better news necessarily. It can be equally as weird and dodgy as what you might get from any human journalist.
That's a very valid point, Jeff. Yeah, thank you for that. One of the questions that's come in here is the panel's view on applications such as TikTok. Now, just this week, obviously TikTok's blown up hugely in the last few months, hasn't it? Just this week, one of the criticisms has been, oh, it's just a way of getting people's personal data, isn't it? Putting causes to a very social media platform by and large. Ivana, is this just a matter of education and understanding what the limits of these technologies are and where your stuff goes? It's just a matter of being informed.
Not really. So it's really it's a complicated question, Brian, because I am a little bit skeptical, and after years in privacy law, I've just come to the conclusion that there is a big illusion of control underpinning the entire privacy argument. The idea that, you know, we have to be so clever and so good to read every single privacy notice that is presented to us online. And especially with the line between the life online and the life offline becoming increasingly blurred, where, you know, you in a few years' time will be going from a smart home to a smart car into a smart office, driving on smart highways. How are we going to navigate this whole system by privacy notices and pop-ups coming, and, you know, where sometimes these systems are deceitful by default, you know, because they are deliberately so complicated to read that just people can't be bothered, and I can't blame them. So there is a real crisis of consent, and there is a real crisis of the mechanism of really giving people the so-called power around what they want to share and what they don't want to share. Is no longer sustainable. And this is just going to increase and become even more dramatic with artificial intelligence and automated decision making. Because the idea that explainability and transparency means that you place the burden yet again on the data subject. What are we supposed to do? What is data subject supposed to do? Open a code and read it? Open a system and understand it? It's fake control. Is not true. It's not possible. And so I think we've got to change our approach to this. And the way we change our approach to this is, first of all, is using technology like privacy and ethics by design and within the design, so that there has to be something in the design of the systems that acknowledge privacy as a differentiator and makes it embedded from day one. Second point, we've got to come up with intermediaries that can actually recognize whether a particular company is deploying tools that are privacy and ethics inside what they're doing. And I'm talking about things like labels, certifications, so that individuals don't have to say, okay, I'm going to query what is happening to my data. I'm going to query how this is the system transparent enough but they can trust a particular system because they know that the system has gone through due diligence. This is the same with sort of privacy notices and data extractivist model. The problem is the real-time bidding process, the digital ecosystem, it's a completely privacy-free zone. And I find it very difficult to place the burden on the individual and say, you've got to look after your data and decide what to share and what not to share. I would actually like things to be the other way around. It is also true, though, that companies often find the most complicated way to explain these things. And when people say there is a privacy paradox, people seem to care so much about privacy, but at the same time, they sign off to everything. Well, that trade-off, the paradox, presented in a very complicated way. Sometimes these things don't have a privacy and ethics by design, whereby it's easier for people to really understand what is happening to their data. So I'm privileged enough, to work with organizations who want to get it right, who really want to identify new methods using privacy enhancing technologies, using dynamic privacy notices, different ways to really involve the consumer, the customer in what they're doing. But this should be the way to go. So in a nutshell, consent model, how do we move forward? The illusion of control. And I think the idea that we've got to find new intermediaries and new ways of dealing with our data that is based on custodianship rather than consent. Because I think consent is very difficult, although it's important, to sustain in a world where we are constantly connected and where there are information constantly gathered for good use and also potentially misuse.
I mean, that's really interesting set of things you said there, Ivana. In fact, straight away, I'm thinking we should have a webinar on the crisis in consent. That seems like a snappy title that I've just written down.
It is. Sorry to chime in, but it is interesting.
Sure.
Over the years, I've had multiple pitches and multiple conversations with people who are all pushing this idea of, well, the consent system is broken, the personal data system is broken. We will step in as a company and we will get people's data and we will then broker on their behalf. We will protect it and we'll do the right things with it, and we'll be able to help them exert control over their data. I don't know of a single one of those companies that's succeeded. I think most of them have just gone by the by. I've never heard from them again. So it's an honorable aim. Maybe now is the time. Maybe there will be something. But this has been years. People have been saying, let's get the consent sorted. Let's get some kind of brokerage together. We'll help people leverage their data ethically and so on. It hasn't happened. So I'm keen on it, but I'm skeptical about it, I have to say.
You read my mind with a question there, Jeff. Thank you very much for that comment. John, can I come to you? Just thinking about Ivana's comment about intermediaries. Is this a governmental watchdog thing? Is it a BCS type role? Should we be relying on the private sector to do that sort of thing? The track record there is perhaps not too great.
Well, again, if you look at the parallels with how do we trust people? I mean, we don't sort of look inside their head and see, with the transparency of their sort of, how do their thought processes work? We judge them sort of over time. Do they keep delivering? Do they do what they say they're going to do? Do they constantly let us down? So we judge people over time. And where we haven't got time to do that, I don't know, we're going to have some building work or some plumbing work done. We do look for intermediaries, don't we? We look for a tradesman that's part of a guild, or so. I think there are parallels, and I think there are these sort of mechanisms that can be set up to help you trust. You might trust a brand in its own right, because your experience of that brand online has always been very good, so you learn to trust. I think there are a variety of mechanisms. The only thing I would say about mandatory certification is it's not free. So as long as you understand that there is a cost associated with that, either in taking time for things to come to market, and that might be entirely reasonable, like sort of the Food and Drug Administration might take 5 years for a drug to come to the market, but you want it to be safe before it gets there. So those sort of mandatory certifications are not free, and again, they're part of the balance of risk and reward. I think I wouldn't want. I don't know. I actually wouldn't want an engine that was telling me what was good on TV tonight to have to be subject to a sort of 3-year testing scheme before it came to the market, as it were.
Ivana, sorry, you're on mute. Carry on.
John, you're right about certifications. I do wonder when you think about it, shouldn't this be risk-based? I mean, shouldn't we as a society say, okay, this is the risk, you know? So for example, I would argue, and this is my personal opinion here, I would argue, John, that what you said about I wouldn't want an algorithm that recommends what I'm doing tonight or what I'm watching tonight, actually, I would find that much more intrusive than other things. The reason being is that to me, there is a major risk in recommendation systems, the risk of brainwashing. So the question, as a society, what do we find high risk? What do we find low risk? Take facial recognition. It's obviously low risk to have facial recognition technology used to organize photos in your phone. Yeah, so if you want to organize pictures, that facial recognition is okay. It's probably medium risk if you're looking at unlocking your bank app with your phone, and it's probably higher risk if you say I'm going to use artificial facial recognition to interview people and to understand whether they are trustworthy or not. So just also that's the breadth of facial recognition. It's not just I think the problem is, what do we find? Can we build a taxonomy of this product based on what are the values that we want to protect? That is the main point. Because the thing is, we can have the most fair, unbiased, perfect system. And that's one issue. But algorithmic fairness and algorithmic is not justice in general. You know, it's not societal fairness or societal justice. They're separate things. So the key thing is, if we want to regulate the whole thing, the focus to me has to be on what are the values that we want to protect. So if the values that we want to protect is personal autonomy of thinking, because this is how individuals grow, then I would place a much greater risk on a recommendation algorithm, because I wouldn't want it to be biased, because if it's biased and I'm a woman, it would keep recommending me things that will keep me in the position I'm in now. So it's that's you know, but this argument about what are the risks is a very tricky one.
I entirely agree that risk-based is the right approach, and I also think you're quite right. There are obvious risks, you know, like you would say, well, autonomous cars are high risk, but I think you're right to point out that some things that might not appear to be high risk, according to some people, would be, and I think that is a debate. I agree with you, a debate that has to be had.
At the beginning of the conversation, the bit I was actually here for at the start, we were talking about just what things are real risks to our civil liberties and our perception of them. So perhaps just to round off, because we've hit our 3/4 of an hour very quickly, so it's been very interesting, obviously. That's why time goes quickly, isn't it? To round out our conversation, just like to get a thought from each of you on what the next few things are that we should be prioritizing in this space. So we've seen huge changes over the last few months because of lockdown. We're going to start coming out of that to an extent. What are the next big things that we should be thinking about to get right in terms of tech and civil liberties? Can I start with you, Jeff?
You're mute, Jeff.
Sorry. There you go.
There we go. I'm unmuted. Yeah, there's been big strides by the technology, the social media companies, and I think some of those are to be applauded. They are moving, probably not as fast or as effectively as a lot of people would want, but there have been some moves. I think the things we have to get right are somehow re-imbuing the public with the ability to trust some sources of information, the power to work out which sources of information to trust, and the self-belief to start making some decisions about what they're going to look at online, what they're going to absorb online, what they're going to share online. I don't think there is a technological or governmental solution to this, in the same way that one of the big effects of the internet has been to push responsibility and power to people. well, they now have power and responsibility, so we have to help them to use it. You know, a top-down approach can only go so far. We've got to put that power in the hands of the people who are actually using this technology. It's a broad answer, but then it was a broad question.
It was, yes. Thank you, Jeff. Ivana.
Three things that we need to do. The first one is I think we need a break and a moratorium of facial recognition technology to understand what we're going to use it for, and to understand that it can be not biased, it can be perfect, but the problem is, you know, we've got to understand what is the use in higher risk situations. So, for example, a concert with kids or our streets, and because facial recognition changes the way that we inhabit our public spaces. So, but I do think it's got its uses. So I think we need to have a discussion about it. The second thing is we need an urgent fitness test of current legislation to understand whether it's able and is sufficient to deal with the harms generated by new technologies. And by harms, I really mean, you know, the being locked out of services, so representational harm, so the perpetuation of stereotypes. And the third harm, I would say, is the correlations versus causations, that you can really mix things up. And is legislation enough? Is anti-discrimination legislation good enough for this? Or is it too complicated and are these new systems too difficult? So I think this is really, really important. The third thing is I think we need to identify what due diligence looks like for companies, because at the moment, there is a massive outcry for social justice happening, especially in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in the US. And this is really important. And this is an historic situation, that it's in a global movement on this. So I do think and companies want to do the right thing. I'm really seeing companies really want to do the right thing right now. And it's important that we determine what that due diligence looks like, and understanding whether we need new tools to determine what that due diligence is, to audit it, and to really certify these companies to say, yes, okay, you're doing things right, so that we can build a different approach, which is based on data custodianship, is based on trust, is based on, rather than putting all the onus on individuals.
John.
Yes, Brian. Those were two very good summaries from Jeff and Ivana. I'll just pick up one thing Ivana said. I would suggest we don't have any sort of moratorium on facial recognition. There are already too many useful applications out there, whether that's football crowds or airports. You know, one of our human rights is security, and facial recognition is helping a lot with security. So let's not have a pause, please. The other thing, and there's a little bit of self-interest here because I chair a think tank that's looking at this, and that is turning the governance of AI from theory into practice. A lot of companies want to be trusted more, want to have AI that, because it's obvious that their customers want to trust their AI, and the companies that are providing the AI want it to be trusted. Otherwise, there is no market. But I think it is time to move from the theory of governance to the practice of governance, and that's what I'm certainly going to be looking at over the course of the next few months. How do we go from the theory of the 7 principles that the European Commission came out with so what does that mean in practice? Time to get practical.
John, that's a great point too. Thank you for that. I recently read that there's currently at least 80 different frameworks for AI ethics, and I don't know, that seems like 79 too many, doesn't it? Jeff, Ivana, John, thank you so much. It's been really interesting. Sorry I missed 10 minutes at the beginning there, but I'm glad I got back in. Just to carry on the conversation, Ivana's book recently was out, An Artificial Revolution on Power, Politics and AI. So I'll give you a little plug there, Ivana. Jeff's new book's coming out soon, isn't it, Jeff? Crime.com. John is going to be the BCS president. Not a book, is it, John? Yeah. But you're going to be BCS president next year.
Yes.
So I'm sure you'll be more than happy to hear from reactions from folks on some of the issues we've raised today. If you're not, I've mentioned it now, so sorry about that. Thank you all so much. We've really enjoyed that, and we will bring this to an end. Jeff, Ivana, John, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ivana and Jeff.